I never imagined that a simple security measure would unravel 30 years of carefully concealed hatred. When my mother installed that camera at our family cabin, she thought she was protecting our property from thieves. Instead, it exposed a betrayal so calculated, so vicious, that it would tear my entire world apart. Let me start from the beginning. It was a peaceful Thursday afternoon, the kind where time seems to slow down just enough to let you breathe. I was in the middle of dusting our living room, carefully wiping down the porcelain vase that had been in my family for generations, when the phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's name. "Cassidy, honey, I need to tell you something." Amara's voice crackled through the speaker, unusually animated. At 75, my mother rarely got excited about anything these days, so her tone immediately caught my attention. "What's going on, Mom? You sound like you just won the lottery." She laughed, a girlish sound that seemed oddly out of place. "Not quite, dear. But I did do something rather clever, if I do say so myself. Remember how we've been worried about all those break-ins at Pine Grove?" I did remember. Our family cabin, nestled in the quiet community of Pine Grove, had become increasingly vulnerable to theft. Garden tools vanished overnight. Rain barrels disappeared without a trace. The sense of security we'd once felt there had slowly eroded with each passing month. Of course I remember. It's been awful. The Hendersons lost their entire tool shed last month. "Well, I took matters into my own hands last week," Amara continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I drove out to the cabin and installed a surveillance camera." I nearly dropped the vase. "You did what?" "I bought one of those tiny cameras online, you know, the kind that's no bigger than a button. Found a nice young man from the community who helped me set it up in the shed. It's motion activated, records everything to a memory card, and I can even watch the footage on my phone through an app." I stood there, momentarily speechless. My mother, who usually needed help sending a text message, had somehow managed to purchase and install a complete surveillance system. My husband Bryce was typically the one who handled anything technological in our family. The thought of my elderly mother navigating online shopping, video apps, and installation instructions was almost comical. "Mom, that's actually pretty impressive. I can't believe you figured all that out yourself." "Oh, it wasn't that difficult once I got the hang of it," she said, clearly pleased with herself. "I wrote down the app name and password for you. I'll give you the paper tomorrow. That way, if anything happens, you can check on the property yourself." After we hung up, I returned to my dusting, though my mind kept wandering back to the conversation. The camera. The surveillance system. It seemed like a smart precaution, given the circumstances. Still, there was something almost amusing about my mother's sudden venture into the world of home security technology. The rest of my evening unfolded in its usual rhythm, grading papers for my students, preparing dinner for Bryce, tackling the mountain of laundry that had accumulated throughout the week. The camera slipped from my thoughts, buried beneath the mundane concerns of daily life. Friday morning arrived with an unexpected jolt. The phone rang at 7:30, a time when our apartment was usually wrapped in peaceful silence. Bryce had already left for his shift at the distribution center, and I was enjoying a rare moment of quiet with my morning coffee. Beverly Jenkins's name flashed on the screen. My mother-in-law was many things, but an early riser she was not. In the 30 years I'd known her, I could count on one hand the number of times she'd called before 10 in the morning. "Good morning, Beverly," I answered, trying to mask my surprise. "Cassidy, dear." Her voice rang out with unusual cheerfulness, almost jarring in its brightness. "I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to ask you something before you got busy with your day." "No, it's fine. What can I help you with?" "Well, I was wondering if I could go up to the cabin this weekend. You know, to check on things. Feed the chickens, maybe do a bit of weeding in the garden. It's been such a long time since I've been out there, and I really feel like I should do my part to help maintain the property." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Beverly, Volunteering for cabin maintenance? The same Beverly who complained endlessly about mosquitoes, dirt roads, and the lack of modern conveniences every single time we mentioned the place? The same woman who referred to our chickens as those filthy birds and wrinkled her nose at the mere thought of rural life? Of course you can go, I managed to say, still processing this bizarre turn of events. You have the spare keys. But Beverly, are you sure? It's quite a bit of work right now. The garden needs serious attention, and the chickens require consistent care. It might be too much for an old woman like me? She cut me off with a laugh that sounded slightly forced. Cassidy, dear, I'm not as frail as you might think. I've been feeling wonderful lately. Strong, energetic. And honestly, I just miss being out in nature. The fresh air, the open spaces, the beauty of the countryside. The city has been so stifling this summer. I gripped the phone tighter, my instincts beginning to whisper warnings I couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't the Beverly I knew. In 3 decades, she had never, not once, expressed appreciation for nature, fresh air, or the beauty of rural landscapes. Her interests had always centered around television shows, neighborhood gossip, and church activities. The outdoors was something to be endured during brief, necessary trips, not something to seek out voluntarily. Well, if you're certain, I said slowly. But maybe you should wait until next weekend. Bryce could drive you up, help you with the heavier tasks. The trip is quite long, and— No, that won't be necessary, Beverly interrupted, her voice taking on an edge I couldn't quite identify. I've already planned everything out. The bus to Pine Grove runs regularly, and if I need to, I can call a taxi. I have money saved up. There's no reason to burden Bryce with this. Now I was truly alarmed. Beverly suggesting she'd take a taxi? This was a woman who clipped coupons religiously, who would walk an extra mile to avoid spending money on public transportation, who calculated the cost of everything down to the penny. The thought of her willingly spending what would amount to a small fortune on a taxi ride to the cabin was completely out of character. Beverly, a taxi all the way to Pine Grove would cost a fortune. That's nearly 50 miles. If you really want to go this weekend, I insist that Bryce drive you Saturday morning. He won't mind at all. I appreciate the offer, dear, but I don't want to trouble my son. He works so hard during the week. He deserves his rest on the weekends. I'm perfectly capable of managing the trip on my own. Her insistence was becoming more than just unusual. It was unsettling. Beverly never refused help, especially when it came from her son. She doted on Bryce, always eager to spend time with him, always happy to accept his assistance with anything and everything. All right, I relented, deciding not to push the issue. Just promise me you'll be careful. And call if you need anything at all. We're just a phone call away. Of course, dear. Thank you so much for understanding. I'll take good care of everything, I promise. After she hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, staring out at the street below without really seeing it. Something about that conversation didn't sit right with me. Beverly's sudden enthusiasm for the cabin, her uncharacteristic willingness to spend money on transportation, her refusal of Bryce's help, none of it made sense. But I had to push these concerns aside. The morning was getting away from me, and I had a full day of teaching ahead. Mathematics tests needed grading, lesson plans required finalizing, and a faculty meeting promised to consume my afternoon. I couldn't afford to dwell on my mother-in-law's strange behavior, no matter how much it nagged at the edges of my consciousness. I hurried through my morning routine, grabbing my bag of papers and rushing out the door just in time to catch the bus to school. As I settled into my seat, my mother's words from the previous day flickered through my mind. Something about the camera, about an app and a password. I should probably mention it to Beverly, let her know she was being recorded. Then my phone rang. The school principal, asking about schedule changes for the upcoming term. The conversation stretched on, complex and demanding my full attention. By the time I hung up, the thought of the camera had evaporated completely, pushed out by the immediate concerns of my workday. The day unfolded in its typical chaos of classes, student questions, administrative tasks, and the endless mountain of papers that needed grading. By the time I finally made it home that evening, exhaustion had settled into my bones. Bryce was already asleep, his early morning shifts requiring him to maintain a strict bedtime schedule. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the darkness. The strange conversation with Beverly kept replaying in my mind. Her tone, her insistence, the enthusiasm that had seemed so forced and artificial. Something was wrong. I couldn't name it, couldn't point to any specific thing she'd said that was overtly suspicious. But 30 years of knowing someone teaches you to recognize when they're not being genuine. And Beverly, during that phone call, had been performing, playing a role. But what role? And why? I finished my tea and headed to bed, telling myself I was overthinking things. People could change. Maybe Beverly had genuinely developed an interest in nature and outdoor activities. Maybe she was trying to be more helpful, more involved with the property. There was no reason to suspect ulterior motives. Still, as I drifted off to sleep, that nagging sense of unease remained, a whisper of warning I couldn't quite silence. Saturday morning dawned bright and early. Bryce was up at the crack of dawn, preparing for a fishing trip with his buddies, something he'd been looking forward to all week. I had planned a thorough cleaning of the apartment, one of those deep clean sessions that always felt satisfying. The doorbell rang at 6:30, startling both of us. Bryce was in the bathroom, and I was still in my pajamas, barely awake enough to function. I opened the door to find Beverly standing there, and the sight nearly made me laugh. My mother-in-law, who typically dressed in neat, modest clothing suitable for church or casual social gatherings, was outfitted like she was preparing for serious manual labor. Dark, sturdy pants, an old, worn jacket that had seen better days, rubber boots caked with dried mud, and most striking of all, 3 enormous duffel bags at her feet. "Good morning, Cassidy," she chirped, her voice that same artificially bright tone from our phone conversation. "I'm off to the cabin. Is Bryce awake?" "He's in the bathroom," I managed to say, still staring at the bags. "Beverly, what on earth is all that? You're only going for the day, aren't you?" "Oh, these? Just some supplies. Feed for the chickens, a few tools I thought might be useful. You know how it is, better to be over-prepared than under-prepared." The explanation was too smooth, too rehearsed. And the bags were far too large and numerous for a simple day trip to feed chickens and do light gardening. Typically, a small backpack with sandwiches and a thermos was more than sufficient for such tasks. Before I could question her further, Bryce emerged from the bathroom. "Mom? What are you doing here so early?" "I'm heading to the cabin, son. I told Cassidy yesterday. I want to check on the property, take care of the chickens, maybe do some weeding." Bryce's expression mirrored my own confusion. "You? At the cabin? Mom, you hate going there." "I never said I hated it," Beverly replied, though we all knew that was a lie. "I just haven't made as much time for it as I should have. But I'm turning over a new leaf. It's important to take care of family property." My husband looked at me, silently asking if I knew what was going on. I shrugged, equally baffled. Bryce offered to drive her to the bus stop, but Beverly refused adamantly, insisting that a walk would do her good. After she left, Bryce shook his head in disbelief. "That was weird, right? I'm not imagining things." "No, you're not imagining things," I confirmed. "Your mother has never, in all the years I've known her, voluntarily offered to go to the cabin, let alone arrive at dawn with enough luggage for a week-long camping trip." "Maybe she's trying to be more helpful?" Bryce suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't quite believe it himself. "Maybe," I echoed, but my instincts were screaming otherwise. The rest of Saturday passed uneventfully. I threw myself into cleaning the apartment, scrubbing surfaces until they gleamed, organizing closets that had been neglected for months. Bryce returned from his fishing trip in high spirits, proudly displaying his catch. We spent the evening together preparing the fish for dinner, falling into the comfortable rhythms of our long marriage. Beverly called around 9 o'clock that night. Her voice came through the phone with that same strange, exaggerated enthusiasm that had characterized all our recent conversations. "Cassidy, dear, I just had to call and tell you what an absolutely wonderful time I'm having. The air up here is so fresh and clean. Everything is so beautiful. The chickens are healthy and happy. I fed them and made sure they had plenty of fresh water. The garden looks marvelous. The tomatoes are coming along beautifully, and the cucumbers are thriving. Even your flowers are absolutely stunning." I gripped the phone tighter, my unease intensifying. This wasn't how Beverly typically spoke. Even on the rare occasions when she'd been pleased about something, her reactions had been measured, understated. This effusive praise, this over-the-top excitement, it felt completely manufactured. "I'm so glad you're enjoying yourself," I said carefully. "Are you planning to stay the night there?" "Oh, yes. I'll do a bit more work in the morning and then catch the 3 o'clock bus back to the city. There's so much to take care of here." Another oddity struck me as we talked. The background noise, or rather, the complete lack of it. When you called someone at the cabin at night, you typically heard the sounds of the countryside. Chickens settling in for the evening, the rustle of wind through trees, sometimes the distant voices of neighbors. But Beverly's call was accompanied by absolute silence, as if she were speaking from inside a soundproof room. "How are the chickens doing tonight?" I asked, testing a suspicion I couldn't quite articulate. There was a pause. Just a second or two, but noticeable. "What?" "Oh, the chickens. Yes, they're fine. They're all settled in for the night. They go to bed early, you know. Smart birds." The hesitation in her voice was brief but unmistakable. She'd stumbled over the question, as if she needed a moment to formulate an appropriate response. After she hung up, I lay in bed for hours, unable to sleep. Every detail of that conversation churned through my mind. The unnatural cheerfulness, the complete silence in the background, the brief pause before answering about the chickens. Something was very, very wrong. I turned to look at Bryce, sleeping peacefully beside me. He always said I had an overactive imagination, that I worried too much about things that probably had simple, innocent explanations. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was reading malicious intent into what was really just an elderly woman trying to be more involved with family property. But my gut, that reliable instinct that had guided me through countless difficult situations, was telling me something different. It was screaming that Beverly was lying, that this entire weekend trip was a facade for something else. But what? What possible reason could she have for deceiving us? Sunday arrived with rain. A cold, steady drizzle that matched my mood perfectly. I woke with a sense of dread I couldn't explain, a heavy weight pressing on my chest that intensified as the day wore on. Bryce noticed my distraction over breakfast. "You're quiet today. Everything okay?" "Just the weather," I lied. "You know how gloomy rain makes me feel." He accepted the explanation without question, returning his attention to the newspaper spread across the kitchen table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to occupy myself with reading, with small household tasks, but my mind kept wandering back to Beverly. What was she doing at the cabin? Why had she been so insistent on going alone? Why had she brought so much luggage for such a short trip? By 8:30 that evening, my concern had transformed into genuine worry. The last bus from Pine Grove to the city departed at 5 o'clock. If Beverly had missed it, how would she get home? I tried calling her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Again and again I tried, with the same result each time. "Bryce," I finally said, unable to keep my anxiety to myself any longer. "Your mother hasn't come home yet. Her phone is off. I'm worried something might have happened." He glanced at the clock and frowned. "That is odd. But you know Mom, she probably got caught up talking to one of the neighbors and lost track of time. If she doesn't show up by morning, we'll drive out there and check on her." His calm acceptance of the situation should have been reassuring, but it only intensified my unease. Something was wrong. I knew it with a certainty that transcended logic or reason. Then, at 10:30, the phone finally rang. Beverly's number flashed on the screen. "Oh, my dears, I'm so sorry I didn't call earlier." Her voice was breathless, apologetic. I was absolutely exhausted when I got home. I lay down immediately and didn't even hear the phone ringing. My battery died too. I completely forgot to bring my charger. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. Plausible. But there was something in her tone, that same false note of forced cheerfulness, that set my teeth on edge. "We were worried," I said. "How did everything go at the cabin?" "Oh, it was wonderful. Just wonderful. The chickens are doing so well. They're laying regularly, healthy as can be. I did some weeding, took care of the garden. The flowers are absolutely gorgeous. Especially those asters by the fence. They're stunning." I felt my breath catch. "The asters don't grow by the fence, Beverly. They're near the deck." Silence. Just for a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Then Beverly laughed, a sound that seemed too loud, too forced. "Oh, of course. Near the deck. How silly of me. My memory isn't what it used to be, you know. Getting old does that to you." The excuse was weak. Beverly had always had an exceptional memory for details. She could recall conversations from years ago, word for word. She never confused the layout of places she'd known for decades. After we hung up, I stood frozen in the middle of our living room, my mind racing. Everything about Beverly's weekend at the cabin felt wrong. The initial insistence on going. The excessive luggage. The overly enthusiastic phone calls. The confusion about the flower locations. The battery that had supposedly died. Each detail individually could be explained away as coincidence or simple mistake. But together, they formed a pattern that my instincts recognized as deception. I went to bed that night with a firm resolution. Tomorrow, I would drive to the cabin myself and see exactly what Beverly had been doing there. Whatever she was hiding, whatever game she was playing, I was going to uncover the truth. Monday morning began like any other. Bryce left for work, complaining good-naturedly about the Monday blues and grabbing his lunch from the refrigerator on his way out the door. I went through my usual routine of cleaning up after breakfast, planning my day, organizing my thoughts. As I wiped down the kitchen table, my hand caught the edge of a stack of papers near the corner. Several sheets fluttered to the floor. Bending to retrieve them, I noticed a small scrap of paper covered in my mother's distinctive, shaky handwriting. The camera. The app. The password. The entire conversation from Thursday came flooding back to me with sudden, startling clarity. My mother had installed a surveillance camera at the cabin. She'd given me access to the footage. I'd completely forgotten about it in the chaos of the weekend. My heart began to race as I grabbed my phone. Within minutes, I'd downloaded the app, registered my account, and entered the password my mother had written down. The interface was simple, showing a calendar of dates with available recordings. Saturday. Sunday. The exact days Beverly had been at the cabin. I selected Saturday morning and pressed play, my hands trembling slightly with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What would I see? Beverly caring for the chickens, as she'd claimed? Weeding the garden? Enjoying the beauty of nature? The video quality was grainy, black and white, but clear enough to make out details. The camera had been positioned in a corner of the shed, providing a wide view of the yard, the chicken coop, and a portion of the garden. The timestamp read 9:30 a.m. I watched as a figure appeared on screen, Beverly, in her dark jacket and sturdy pants, entering through the garden gate. But instead of heading directly to the chicken coop or the house, she stopped. Right in the middle of the yard, she stood completely still, her head turning slowly from side to side. She was looking around. Searching. But for what? I watched, transfixed, as Beverly walked the perimeter of the property. She checked behind the shed. She looked up at the neighboring houses. She inspected the fence line. Every movement was careful, methodical, as if she were making absolutely certain that no one was watching her. This went on for nearly 10 minutes. Only when she seemed satisfied that she was completely alone did Beverly finally move toward the house and disappear from the camera's view. I fast-forwarded through the next 30 minutes. The screen showed only an empty yard and the occasional chicken wandering past, pecking at the ground. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. Then Beverly emerged from the house, and everything changed. She was carrying the large duffel bags she'd brought with her that morning. But now, her entire demeanor had shifted. The caution from before had vanished, replaced by swift, purposeful movements. She walked directly to the chicken coop without hesitation, without looking around. I turned up the volume on my phone, straining to hear what was happening. Beverly opened the door to the coop and disappeared inside. When she emerged minutes later, she was carrying one of the bags. It was moving, bulging, and from it came muffled sounds of distress. My heart stopped. I watched, unable to believe what I was seeing, as Beverly systematically caught every single one of our chickens. One by one, she grabbed them, stuffed them into her bags, zipped them closed, and carried them to a hiding spot near the fence. 32 chickens. The entire flock we'd raised over several years. The birds I'd cared for, fed daily, worried over during harsh winters. Gone. Stolen by my own mother-in-law. But she wasn't finished. Once the chicken coop stood empty, Beverly moved to the garden. I watched in growing horror as she began destroying everything I'd worked so hard to cultivate. The tomato plants, carefully nurtured from seedlings, now heavy with ripening fruit, were stomped flat under her rubber boots. The carrots I'd planted in early spring were yanked from the ground and tossed aside like garbage. The pepper bushes, which had just begun producing, were snapped in half with brutal efficiency. She worked with a kind of manic intensity, as if she were attacking an enemy rather than plants. There was nothing random or accidental about her actions. This was methodical, intentional, cruel. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't look away. I had to see everything, had to understand the full scope of what Beverly had done. She moved from the vegetable garden to the flower beds. The asters I'd grown from seeds, carefully transplanting them once they were strong enough. The chrysanthemums I divided from my mother's garden and nurtured through their first season. The dahlias that had just begun their spectacular bloom. Beverly trampled them all. Deliberately. Viciously. Leaving nothing but broken stems and crushed petals in her wake. Then she turned her attention to the patio furniture. The small table Bryce had built with his own hands, a labor of love one summer. She flipped it over and dragged it behind the shed. The benches we'd refinished together were scattered across the yard like discarded toys. The decorative windmill I'd bought last year, a cheerful addition to the landscape, was snapped in half and thrown into the raspberry bushes. I fast-forwarded through the footage, my stomach churning with each new act of destruction I witnessed. Beverly worked until nightfall, pausing only occasionally to drink water from the well. She showed no signs of fatigue, no hesitation, no remorse. In one segment, I caught her speaking. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I could read her lips well enough to understand the gist. "Now that worthless woman will understand," she muttered, grinding her heel into the remnants of the tomato plants. Bryce will finally see what kind of wife he married. The motive crystallized with shocking clarity. This wasn't random destruction. This wasn't an episode of confusion or mental decline. This was calculated revenge, a deliberate attempt to make me look incompetent, to destroy my reputation as a homemaker, to create a wedge between Bryce and me. I sat back in my chair, my entire body trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. 30 years. 30 years of marriage to Bryce. 30 years of knowing Beverly, of including her in our lives, of trying to maintain a cordial relationship despite our differences. And all that time, she had been harboring this level of hatred? Nursing grudges and resentments that I'd never even suspected? Planning revenge for perceived slights I wasn't even aware of committing? I forced myself to continue watching. Sunday's footage brought new revelations that were somehow even more disturbing than Saturday's destruction. Early Sunday morning, around 7 a.m., Beverly emerged from the house carrying a broom. For a moment, I thought she might be planning to clean up the evidence of her vandalism. But no, she had something else in mind entirely. She swept the paths carefully, meticulously, as if preparing for important visitors. Then she put on garden gloves and began rearranging the debris she'd created the day before. The broken rose branches were positioned to look like they'd been snapped by strong winds. The overturned furniture was carefully placed to suggest vandals had attacked the property. Every element of chaos was artfully staged to look like the work of someone other than Beverly herself. This wasn't just destruction anymore. This was theater. She was crafting a narrative, creating a scene that would tell a story when Bryce and I eventually saw it. A story in which I was the villain, the negligent homemaker who couldn't properly care for the family property. Around 10 a.m., Beverly began preparing to leave. She gathered the bags containing the stolen chickens and dragged them toward the gate, hiding them behind the fence where they wouldn't be visible from the road. Then she did one final walkthrough of the property, checking to make sure everything was exactly as she wanted it. Satisfied with her work, she entered the house one last time. An hour passed with no activity visible on the camera. Then she emerged, locked the door, and headed toward the gate. The final frame showed her struggling to drag the heavy bags full of chickens toward the bus stop. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. The sheer scale of Beverly's betrayal was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or an impulsive act of anger. This was premeditated, planned, executed with cold precision. How long had she been nurturing this hatred? How many years had she hidden behind a mask of civility while secretly despising me? And what else might she have done? What other small cruelties or sabotages that I'd never noticed? My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. My mother's number flashed on the screen. "Hello," I answered, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Cassidy, dear, I was just calling to check in. Do you need anything brought to the cabin? I could drive out there next week if you'd like." "No, Mom. Thank you, but no." Should I tell her what I'd discovered? Share what her camera had captured? But something held me back. I needed time to think, to decide how to handle this. Telling my mother now would only complicate things before I'd figured out my next move. After we hung up, I watched the footage again. And again. Each viewing confirmed what I'd seen initially, adding new details that made Beverly's actions even more damning. There was the moment when she'd called me Sunday evening, standing in the middle of the destroyed yard with a smile on her face, lying about how wonderful everything looked. The performance was chilling in its falseness. There was the careful way she'd positioned each element of destruction to support her narrative. There was the satisfied expression she wore as she surveyed her handiwork. Every frame was evidence, proof not just of theft and vandalism, but of something deeper and more disturbing, a capacity for calculated cruelty that I'd never imagined Beverly possessed. My first instinct was to drive immediately to Beverly's house, to confront her face to face, to demand explanations. to make her admit what she'd done. But reason prevailed. Beverly would deny everything. She'd claim the video was edited, that I was trying to frame her, that this was all some elaborate plot to turn Bryce against his mother. Without a witness, without irrefutable proof, it would be my word against hers. My second thought was to tell Bryce immediately, to show him the videos, to let him see with his own eyes what his mother had done. But doubt crept in. Bryce loved his mother deeply. He'd always defended her, always taken her side in any disagreement between us. Would he even believe the evidence? Or would his love and loyalty blind him to the truth? I sat at the kitchen table for hours, the phone in my hand, my mind churning through options and scenarios. Finally, clarity came. I called Bryce's work number. He answered on the third ring, sounding surprised. "Cassidy, is everything okay? You usually don't call me at work." I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what I was about to say. My voice came out cold, controlled, empty of emotion. "Your mother is a monster." Then I hung up. The phone rang immediately. Bryce, calling back, demanding explanations. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and again. I ignored every attempt. I needed time. Time to save the most damning footage to my phone's memory. Time to create backup copies in the cloud. Time to ensure that the evidence couldn't be lost or destroyed. As I worked, methodically preserving every crucial moment of Beverly's destruction, a strange calm settled over me. The initial shock and rage had burned away, leaving behind something harder, colder, more determined. Beverly had made one critical mistake in all her planning. She'd never considered the possibility of surveillance. In her mind, there was no witness to her crimes, no evidence beyond the destruction itself. She'd been so confident in her scheme that she'd never imagined someone might be watching. That arrogance would be her downfall. By the time I'd secured all the evidence, I'd made my decision. This wasn't something that could be handled within the family. The scale of Beverly's actions, the theft, the destruction, the calculated cruelty, went beyond a simple family dispute. This required real consequences. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. The police station was only a few blocks away. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting across from Desk Sergeant Miller, explaining why I needed to file a report. He listened with obvious skepticism. An elderly woman stealing chickens and vandalizing her own family's property wasn't exactly a common complaint. He probably thought I was exaggerating, that this was some petty family squabble being blown out of proportion. "Ma'am, are you certain about what you're alleging? These are serious charges to bring against a family member, especially an elderly one. Perhaps this was all just a misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I said firmly. "I have video evidence of everything. Would you like to see it?" That got his attention. He directed me to Detective Marcus Price, who handled property crimes. Detective Price was in his late 40s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much human ugliness over the years. He listened to my story with the practiced patience of a professional, making notes but clearly reserving judgment. "Mrs. Jordan, I understand you're upset, but you have to understand how this sounds. You're accusing your own mother-in-law of—" "Just watch," I interrupted, pulling out my phone. "Please. Just watch the footage." I played the video from beginning to end. Detective Price watched in silence, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise to something approaching shock as the full scope of Beverly's actions became clear. "Stop," he said halfway through the chicken theft sequence. "Rewind that. Let me see it again." He watched that section 3 times, his jaw tightening with each viewing. Then he continued through the rest of the footage, the garden destruction, the furniture vandalism, the careful staging of the scene. When it finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. I need you to provide documentation proving your ownership of the property, he said, his tone now businesslike and serious. Do you have purchase receipts for the chickens? Any proof that you're the one who cared for the garden and maintained the property? Some of the chickens I bought, others I raised from chicks. The garden, the flowers, I have receipts for seeds, plants, supplies. I've been maintaining that property for years. I can provide whatever documentation you need. Detective Price nodded slowly. We'll open a case. The video evidence is compelling, and what you've shown me clearly indicates both theft and intentional property destruction. I'll need to take a formal statement from you.